Before there was President Franklin Roosevelt, before Eleanor marched and the world stood at the edge of ruin, there was Sarah, born before the Civil War, into a world of porcelain rituals and brutal expectations. Sara Delano was raised not to lead but to endure. She crossed oceans as a child, buried siblings before adolescence, and learned early that silence was survival. Her father, a merchant who made his fortune in opium, ruled the house with absolute command. They were Astor 400, the elite of the Gilded Age, an American aristocracy bred to believe in bloodlines and their Mayflower past. At 26, she married a man 30 years her senior. She nearly died in childbirth, but what rose from the blood was purpose. She didn't just raise Franklin, she sculpted him, fed him, schooled him, dressed him, bankrolled him. Every lesson, every dollar, every ounce of power she gave to him. When he strayed from Eleanor, she cut him off. No more money, no more escape. You will stay, you will lead, you will rise. When polio shattered him, it was Sarah who paid for his return, Sarah who stood at his bedside, and Sarah who told him, you will walk again. She clashed with Eleanor, ruled Springwood like a kingdom, funded war relief, hosted the King and Queen of England, and she never, not once, let go. And in 1924, when 12,000 delegates roared and Franklin crossed the stage on trembling legs, it was Sarah who saw the halo. This isn't the story of the mother behind the man. It's the story of the woman who made him, a matriarch, a monarch, the quiet storm behind an American dynasty. This is the untold story of Sara Delano Roosevelt. If you love stories like this, we have over 80 women's biographies on this channel, with even more coming this summer. So please subscribe and be part of it. Now let's begin the remarkable life of the woman who forged a president. Sara Delano was born into a world that believed in borders, of land, of lineage, of behavior. A world where silver gleamed before breakfast, where little girls spoke French before they spoke their minds, and where the highest virtue was composure. The year was 1854. The place was Algonac, a sprawling estate on the Hudson River, tucked between Albany's stone halls and Manhattan's rising towers. Behind rustling beech trees and a square brick facade, Sarah entered the world as quietly as she would one day rule it. The Hudson Valley wasn't just a landscape, it was inheritance. America's river aristocracy built sanctuaries along its banks, marble stair by marble stair. Children played beneath portraits of Puritan ancestors, while governesses read from Pilgrim's Progress. Everything had its place, especially the Delanos. They didn't display wealth, they embodied it. Sarah's father, Warren, had returned from China with a fortune measured in silks, porcelain, and silence. He had made his name in opium, though such things were rarely spoken aloud. But it wasn't his money that defined him. It was his authority. Sarah's childhood was not merely privileged. It was choreographed. Each morning began with a bell, each hour allotted to a lesson, a meal, a walk, the scent of beeswax, the rustle of petticoats, the click of mother-of-pearl scissors. This was her world. She would later call it tranquil. What she meant was controlled. At age 4, Sarah gashed her head on a cabinet and ran to her father, bleeding. He said nothing. He cleaned the wound and stitched it shut himself. Be brave, he told her. She didn't cry. That moment became her myth. Pain endured in silence, love expressed through control. Her mother, Catherine, was gentler, musical, composed. But Sarah admired her father more than she imitated her mother. Her loyalty, even then, was to iron, not lace. With his competence, his preferred word for fortune, Warren had purchased Algonac. 40 rooms, wide corridors hung with family portraits, rosewood furniture, a Buddhist bell in the garden. The house was not ostentatious, it was ordained. Sarah grew up steeped in ritual. The world beyond stirred, war loomed, fortunes shifted. But inside Algonac, the clock never skipped a beat. That rhythm became her law. And in time, she would pass it on, not as a suggestion, but as scripture, to her only son. The children never heard their parents quarrel. Warren ruled with a glance. While not all Democrats are horse thieves, he'd proclaim at breakfast, all horse thieves are Democrats. Sarah drank it in with her morning chocolate. Catherine kept the machinery running with invisibility. She never contradicted Warren. Her grace lay in orbiting power, not contesting it. Sarah would adopt this posture herself, then find it hard to escape. But when Sarah was 7, the illusion cracked. In 1857, the American economy collapsed. Warren, like many, lost everything. He sold the Manhattan townhouse. Algonac fell quiet. Then, with the same resolve he'd once used threading a needle through his daughter's scalp, Warren returned to China to restore his fortune. He left behind a pregnant wife, 7 children, and an estate still manicured but hollow with absence. Catherine remained. She managed the household like bone china, beautiful, brittle, and breakable. A cousin taught lessons. An aunt enforced posture. The older girls sewed for Union soldiers. Warren wrote from abroad. Sarah soaked the stamps off his letters. "There was no one like my father," she said, decades later, with the certainty of someone who had stopped comparing. Then in 1862, Warren summoned the family to Hong Kong. Catherine, who had once buried a child in the heat of Canton, gathered 7 living children and boarded a ship. No husband, no help, no complaint. Her diary spoke only of weather and waves. "We must look forward to the happy meeting with our husband and father in Hong Kong." The voyage took 6 months, past the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean into the South China Sea. The Delanos were the only paying passengers. There were chilblains, vomiting, heat like a curtain, but structure prevailed. Latin was recited to the rhythm of the sea. On calm days, they dined on oyster soup and pork. Sarah remembered sea shanties, constellations, flag signaling. Discomfort for her was not trauma. It was routine. In later years, Franklin would keep a model of that very ship on his Oval Office desk. In Hong Kong, they moved into Rose Hill, a walled estate where American holidays were observed, hymns were sung, pony carts decorated. China existed beyond the gates. But inside, America held. Then illness struck. Her brother Philippe caught diphtheria. Sarah, just 10, was sent home, along with her older brother and younger sibling. Her sister Annie, 15, shepherded them across the world. Their parents stayed behind. It would be 2 years before they saw them again. In photographs from this time, Sarah stares into the lens. Square jaw, composed mouth, eyes that reveal nothing. A serious girl, the daughter of command. Warren returned to America wealthy once more, and unrepentant. The opium trade had built his empire, and he never denied it. "I do not pretend to justify the opium trade morally," he wrote, "but as a merchant, I insist it was fair, honorable, and legitimate, no different from importing wine or spirits." Sarah never questioned the silk or porcelain that filled their home. To her, the Delanos were the best of America. Mayflower stock, civic leaders, self-made men who still read Latin. Her father was a monument, and the monument never cracked. Rather than settle in a fractured post-war republic, Warren took the family to Paris, where order wore perfume and wealth spoke French. Their apartment near the Avenue de l'Impératrice overlooked the 1867 Exposition. Paris was gay with flags and bunting, Sarah recalled. She and her brother watched sovereigns parade past, but it was Empress Eugenie, gliding through the crowd, who captured her heart. But Paris, like childhood, wasn't built to last. Warren tired of the city's continental riffraff. They moved to Dresden, where the walls echoed coldly and the customs were stiff. Sarah, now fluent in French, turned to German, music, and history. Then came the telegram. Her eldest sister, Louise, was dead. Sarah packed her trunks in silence. Her grief, like her gloves, was folded into the corners. She boarded the Westphalia, the last ship to leave Germany before war engulfed Europe. Once again, the Delanos escaped history's bloodshed. Sarah returned to Algonac, taller, paler, composed. Life resumed. Skating parties, church on Sundays, lamplight readings, and rainy afternoons in the schoolroom. Grief became routine. The next chapter should have been predictable. Debutante balls, dinners, the soft search for a husband. But Sarah waited. She had no need to marry for money. The Delanos were already among the 400, invited to Mrs. Astor's ballroom as a matter of course. She was intelligent, unflappable, discerning. She joined her mother on charity rounds, but remained cloistered. Suitors came. Warren held the gate. Who are his people? He'd ask. That mattered more than roses or charm. At 21, one name slipped through. Stanford White, magnetic and promising. He sent flowers. Warren intercepted both the bouquet and the man. "I do not care for that one," he said, and Sarah obeyed. She danced at the patriarch balls. She was admired, statuesque, elegant, but she preferred books to flirtation. By 26, she had endured 7 seasons. Her sisters were married. Her friends had children. Still, she waited, not with restlessness, but with serene resolve. She managed the household, walked with her father after supper, became his confidant. She was the daughter he would not give away. Then, in April 1880, something shifted. At a small dinner at the Roosevelt home, she sat beside a man who spoke only to her. James Roosevelt, widowed and silver-haired, was 26 years her senior. A lawyer, landowner, and family friend was considered one of them. Quietly wealthy, impeccably mannered. He paid visits to Algonac. She visited Springwood. Walks, tea, and gentle conversation. Within a week, it was clear they had chosen each other. Warren was stunned. James was a Democrat, an Episcopalian. But Sarah said simply, "I want this," and Warren yielded. 10 weeks later, they were engaged. Sarah would later say, "James was the first person who made me realize a Democrat can be a gentleman." The wedding was elegant but restrained. Her beloved aunt had died just weeks before. Still, it was a display of quiet grandeur. Guests traveled upriver by steamer and carriage, through villages hung with bunting. Observers noted the contrast. Sarah, radiant in white brocade, towered over her groom, graying, stooped, already softened by the years. "Such a brilliant girl," someone whispered, "to marry a man so much her senior." But Sarah had made her choice. She did not flinch. After the ceremony, she stepped from her father's carriage into her husband's. Halfway to Hyde Park, she changed coaches, quietly, symbolically crossing the threshold. At Springwood, she wrote in her journal, "Marriage of James Roosevelt and Sara Delano, October 7th, 1880. Outwardly, it was a seamless passage, from daughter to wife, one estate to another. But Sarah brought greater wealth. There were no dowries. This was not elevation. It was continuity. She believed in hierarchy, daughter, wife, mother. But beneath that title was the same composed authority, the girl who never cried when the needle pierced her scalp. At first, she adapted. She traded Unitarian hymns for the solemnity of St. James Episcopal. She played bezique, kept the late wife's carpets, even kept the Scottish housekeeper. Her only change? The drawing room curtains, replaced with Chinese damask from her father. Quiet. Symbolic. The new mistress of Springwood had arrived. The Roosevelt web soon enclosed her. Across the lawn lived James's son Rosie, his wife Helen, and their young son Taddy. Nearby stood the grand villa of James's mother, still the reigning matriarch in her lace cap. A mile away, Uncle John Roosevelt presided over another house full of children and noise. Yet, when James traveled to Manhattan, Sarah summoned the carriage and returned to Algonac. The deep Chesterfields and cabinets glittering with jade still whispered of home. Springwood was an extension, not a severance. The crown had passed, but the altar remained. Politics rarely touched their lives. James, a staunch Democrat, disdained the glad handing of office seekers and passed that wariness to Sarah. 5 days after the 1880 election, the newlyweds sailed to Europe. Their 10-month honeymoon unfolded like a procession of inheritance. Italy, Switzerland, Holland, Spain. They traveled in private carriages, stayed in grand hotels, shopped for Renaissance tapestries, and avoided beggars with polite discretion. Sarah's diary was a ledger of sights, not feelings. Garden walks in Florence, concerts, consuls, cathedrals. In Paris, Warren rented an entire floor of the Hôtel du Rhin for a month of opera. In London, they dined with Madame Goldschmidt, once the Swedish nightingale, Jenny Lind, now stout and cheerful in black taffeta. Sarah found bullfights cruel and wrote only, "James too devoted to me." Her entries revealed little, but in York that August she nearly fainted during service. She was 4 months pregnant. It was time to return. Aboard the Germanic, she wrote, "Such happy days." Back at Springwood, winter descended. Gas lamps flickered, and in January, 16 months after their wedding, Sarah went into labor. The child would not come. Chloroform was administered. The baby, large, blue, silent, slid into the world. Then came a cry. The child lived. Sarah nearly did not. James recorded, "At 8:45, my Sally had a splendid, large baby boy. He weighs 10 pounds, without clothes." A son had been born, a legacy renewed, but the triumph was shadowed. Sarah's brother Philippe had just died. 12 days later, her young nephew succumbed to typhoid. Her recovery was slow. She remained in bed for weeks. The doctor warned against future pregnancies. Sarah did not mourn the verdict. She redirected everything, every ounce of herself, toward the child she had. Where society women handed infants to nursemaids, Sarah nursed Franklin herself. She dressed him, rocked him, shielded him. From the moment he drew breath, Franklin was the sun around which her days revolved. and would remain as long as she lived. Even his name was hard-won. Roosevelt tradition dictated Isaac. James insisted. But Sarah, usually deferential, stood firm. She proposed Warren. In the end, she chose a gentler name, Franklin, for her favorite uncle. Her father approved. "A beautiful little fellow," he wrote, "well and strong, with a good-shaped head of the Delano type." In March, they christened the child Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The family lunched afterward, unaware how far that name would travel. Sarah resumed her quiet command at Hyde Park, driving her dog cart through the countryside, delivering food, bolts of flannel, flowers for the sick. Wherever she went, Franklin followed, bundled in starched skirts, blonde curls gleaming. His first smile, tooth, and step were noted in her diary. She dressed him in kilts, then London sailor suits. When his curls were cut at 5, she saved them in a silk-lined box, her reliquary of devotion. At Springwood, he was treated like a little prince. At Algonac, he was adored. Once, when asked what made him so charming, the 4-year-old replied, "Oh yes, I'm chock full of tacks." It became a family joke and a prophecy. Up to the age of 7, Franklin once said, Hyde Park was the center of the world, and from his first breath, he had been the center of Sarah's. When Franklin was 3, the family resumed travel. By 4, he had visited Europe's capitals, climbed the Eiffel Tower, and admired golden palaces from a velvet-lined carriage. But in 1885, returning on the Germanic, a violent storm struck. Waves smashed the hull. Water poured under doors. The captain was unconscious. Lifeboats were lost. James feared the ship might sink. Sarah did not panic. "Poor little boy," she whispered. "If he must go down, he will go down warm." She wrapped Franklin in her fur coat and waited. James demanded the ship turn back. It did. The Germanic limped into Liverpool. Franklin would never forget how his parents met fear, with stillness. It would serve him well through the fires that were to come. In 1886, the family visited Washington. James declined a diplomatic post, preferring Hyde Park. While he lobbied for business, Sarah thrived, floating through dinners and teas, admired for her poise. At the White House, President Cleveland tousled Franklin's curls. "My little man," he said, "I'm making a strange wish, that you may never be president." Sarah, who shared her husband's distaste for politics, wrote it in her diary. Years later, asked if she foresaw her son's rise, she replied, "Never, oh never. My highest ideal was that he grow up straight and honorable, just and kind, like his father." 2 themes ran through Sarah's diaries like a watermark: the closeness of family and a constant watchfulness over the health of her husband and son. Her worst fear came to life in 1889. At 7, Franklin fell gravely ill aboard the Adriatic, en route to England. Diagnosed with typhoid fever, he was carried to the captain's quarters. Sarah sat beside him, sleepless, upright, unmoved, watching, waiting. When they docked in Liverpool, a private tender met the ship. A nurse was dispatched. Franklin was carried to recover in a doctor's home. Sarah refused to leave until she was certain, absolutely certain, that her child would live. Only then did she return to her routines. Frequent trips to Manhattan let her slip back into the theater and music scenes. Her diary noting performances by Nellie Melba, Paderewski, Sarah Bernhardt, Sir Henry Irving. Franklin, meanwhile, delighted in the Museum of Natural History and carriage rides through Central Park. In the evenings, Sarah appeared in black satin and diamonds, elegant, understated, the quiet perfection of old money. Summers belonged to Campobello. On that wild island off the Maine coast, the Roosevelt cottage overlooked the Bay of Fundy. Sarah organized tea parties and sailing outings. Under her vigilant eye, Franklin became a skilled young sailor, mastering the treacherous tides with confidence that would later serve him in deeper, more political waters. In public, she and James appeared the picture of marital harmony. But beneath the polish, something shifted. Theirs had become a marriage marked by temperament and time. Sarah, still young and socially alive, longed for opera houses and conversation. James, aging and cerebral, preferred a book, a cigar, and quiet. His rigidity sometimes clashed with Sarah's loyalties. They never shared a bedroom. It was not unusual for their class. But after childbirth, intimacy ebbed into quiet abstention, an agreement never spoken, never broken. She was content to define herself as wife and mother. In her diary, she recorded Franklin's development with precision. She praised his Delano determination never to make a fuss. One winter in Paris, James hired a governess. Sarah, fiercely protective of her bond with Franklin, found the young woman overbearing. Franklin never complained. Only when asked directly did he murmur, "I think she's perfectly awful." And why hadn't he said so? Because after all the trouble and expense, it seemed wrong to grumble. His stoicism, like his charm, had been learned at his mother's knee. In 1890, James Roosevelt suffered a heart attack, which diminished both his stamina and his presence. Sarah assumed control over finances, travel, and Franklin's future. A London doctor prescribed the mineral springs of Bad Nauheim for James, and for several summers the family took the cure. To occupy her energetic son in the quiet spa town, Sarah enrolled him in a local school. He wrote home in delight, "Papa got me a great big boat. I sail it every day. I have a splendid bow and arrow. I go to school with a lot of little Mickeys and study German history and arithmetic." His ability to adapt, even among strangers, mirrored Sarah's own resilience. But when the waters offered little reprieve, Sarah sought escape in the Black Forest. One summer, she and 9-year-old Franklin climbed the Blauen, an alpine peak over 3,800 feet high, and spent the night in a mountain lodge. At dawn, watching the sun catch on distant peaks, she savored what James no longer could: vitality. As their stays in Bad Nauheim grew longer, they began stopping in London first. Sarah visited her sister Cassie, her stepson Rosie, her circle of American friends. Dora and Annie offered laughter and a link to their golden girlhood at Algonac. She lunched, shopped on Regent Street, treated Franklin to ice cream at Fuller's, and she passed down what mattered most. By 10, Franklin spoke French and German, knew naval history, bird watching, and the capitals of Europe. His stamp collection grew. His worldview expanded. It was hard for people to believe he had never been to school, Sarah later wrote. They marveled at his grasp of subjects that did not ordinarily interest children so young. And yet, even she understood that the cocoon must one day open. By the time Franklin neared adolescence, she conceded, reluctantly, that it was time for him to meet other boys. To learn the social choreography she could not teach, to step just slightly beyond the borders of Hyde Park. The choice had been made years earlier, when Franklin was still an infant. Sarah and James had enrolled him in a school that did not yet exist. Groton, the new academy in the Massachusetts hills, founded by Reverend Endicott Peabody. Modeled after the British public school ideal, Groton aimed to mold the sons of American wealth into Christian gentlemen. Rigid timetables, austere dormitories, and the resounding motto, "To serve is to rule." Reverend Peabody wanted Franklin to begin at 12. But Sarah could not bear it. Not yet. The child was still hers. 3 years later, she relented. After a return from Europe in 1896, Sarah steeled herself. "We dusted his birds," she wrote. "He had a swim in the river. I looked on, with a heavy heart." On September 15th, they boarded the private railroad car north. At Groton, she helped him unpack. She adjusted his socks, noted his white-faced resolve, and before the farewell, he visited the train one last time. That night, she confided, "It is hard to leave my darling boy." Franklin's first letters home were cheerful and polite. "I am getting on finely both mentally and physically. We study French tonight." Sarah preserved them all. Some she corrected in the margins, and when a letter failed to arrive on time, she telegraphed Reverend Peabody. Was he sleeping? Was he cold? Had he been hurt? In October, they visited. Franklin was well and handsome, full of punctuality, Latin prizes, clean shoes. Sarah beamed. Everything was in order. But all was not well. Franklin, raised among adults, had no armor for the rough rituals of boyhood. His polished manners, faintly English accent, and delicacy in sport all marked him as different. He found it difficult at first, a classmate would recall, with these handicaps, to adjust to boarding school life. Sarah never imagined it. She assumed society would open to Franklin as it had to her, smoothly, gracefully. She never guessed her radiant boy would suffer to belong. But he endured, and he learned something his mother had never needed. Pain could be hidden beneath charm. It was a lesson that would carry him farther than Groton's chapel. Back at Springwood, James continued his slow, deliberate decline. Even the September train to see Franklin off had left him bedridden for days. Sarah, frightened, wrote, "It has almost made me ill." There was no longer any doubt. James required constant care. In April 1897, Sarah and James set sail for Europe, leaving Franklin behind for the first time. Nothing but James's health would induce me to cross the ocean without Franklin, she wrote. From school, Franklin wrote wistfully, I am thinking of you as sitting in your chairs on deck, enjoying this lovely weather. In Germany, the rituals resumed. Tea at Bad Nauheim, slow walks, Episcopal services. But the rhythms of health, once believed eternal, were now breaking down. The next year, another telegram came. Franklin had scarlet fever. James is so upset, Sarah wrote, that I dare not show how I feel. When a second cable followed, Franklin developed inflamed kidneys, Sarah broke. Within 24 hours, she booked passage and crossed the Atlantic, enduring 8 days at sea with no word of her child's condition. Sarah faced an impossible choice: remain isolated with her son or return to Hyde Park to tend her husband. She chose a third path. On the school grounds, she found a ladder. Lifting her skirts, she climbed to the second-story window of the infirmary and tapped softly on the glass. Each time, Franklin looked up to see her there, composed, smiling through the wind. A boy behind a window, a mother refusing to be kept out. But the world around her was changing. In 1898, her father Warren passed. Sarah stood vigil at his bedside holding his hand. The man who had taught her strength, stoicism, passing from her world. Sarah composed herself and carried on as Warren had taught her. That autumn, Franklin, now taller than his mother, entered Harvard. Sarah's diary entries before Franklin's departure for college were unusually tender. On her 46th birthday, she wrote, My dear James surprised me with a cake and candles and sapphire sleeve links. 3 days later, Franklin took her on a long, quiet canoe ride down the Hudson. The next morning, he left for Boston. Our dear Franklin left us for college. A great step. His first weeks at Harvard were unsettled by scandal. His cousin, Taddy Roosevelt, son of Rosie, had dropped out of Harvard and vanished into the shadows of the Tenderloin district. After his mother's death, Taddy had grown erratic. Now, he had eloped with a Hungarian-born dance hall girl, Sadie Messenger. Short and plump, the newspapers smirked, but accounted a beauty of her type. The press erupted. Boy millionaire weds, Astor Scion's bride won in dance hall, crowed the headlines. Just as Uncle Theodore campaigned for the vice presidency, the disgrace hit James Roosevelt hard. Sarah wrote bitterly to Franklin, I am sorry Taddy has Papa's name if he is not going to grace it. 2 nights later, James suffered a second heart attack. The dreadful business about Taddy was the last straw, she confided in her diary. Franklin rushed home, and in a final attempt to save him, Sarah moved James to Manhattan to be near his doctor. Franklin sat beside him daily. In the early hours of December 8, 1900, surrounded by his wife and 2 sons, James Roosevelt died. All is over, Sarah wrote in her diary. Back at Springwood, alone for the first time in decades, Sarah filled her diary with sorrow. The days drag on, we have to bear them. Christmas passed in near silence. As Franklin prepared to return to Harvard, she wrote simply, I dread his leaving. But grief did not consume her. She took up James's routines, riding Bobby, the Kentucky saddle horse she had gifted him for his 71st birthday, overseeing the filling of the ice houses, tending to the ancient rhythms of Springwood. She reassured Franklin, you need not worry about me. I am all right. She resumed calling on the Vanderbilts. She spent time with her sisters and began traveling annually to London and Paris, now as a woman entirely her own. Sarah's refusal to crumble left a deep imprint on Franklin, whose own stoicism in the face of polio would later echo hers. James's will left her everything: Springwood, Campobello, the family's investments. Franklin, still legally a minor, received a generous trust, but it was clear the future belonged to her command. There were suitors. Sarah was wealthy, exquisitely dressed, fluent in 3 languages, and unchallenged in social rank. But no one breached the fortress of her self-possession. Her loyalty now belonged to one person, Franklin, and as she had done her whole life, she would pour her heart and soul into her son. There would be no chaos, only command. Regal in black silk, Sarah issued instructions to servants, presided over Springwood, organized charities, and kept meticulous notes on Franklin's development. She had no hunger for the world's stage, but within her private empire, she ruled without rival. She wanted Franklin to flourish, but never drift too far. She hoped he'd marry someone who would preserve her place at the center of his life, not replace it. He welcomed her attention, until of course he didn't. Remember, she chided, It takes only 10 or 15 minutes to write a nice letter to your ever-loving mother. Franklin obliged. Letters came from Harvard, updates on rowing crew, debates, club elections, the crimson. The stream of achievement soothed her. His father and I always expected a great deal of Franklin, she said. We were pleased, but not surprised when he delivered. What she never knew, he'd been rejected from the Porcellian Club, his father's old fraternity. He didn't tell her. Even a small disappointment might summon her to Cambridge. Her care was protection, disguised as control. And Franklin was learning the skill that would define his adulthood, managing Sarah. To her, he was still a child, especially when money was involved. She didn't yet see how carefully he had begun to curate her version of his life. In the summer of 1901, they cruised to Norway, just mother and son with family friends. But when they docked in America, a telegram awaited. President McKinley had been assassinated. Franklin's distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, was now president of the United States. Shock gave way, quickly in Sarah's circle, to a ripple of pride, a Roosevelt in the White House. Family legacy made visible. But time was pressing forward, and Sarah had begun to feel it. She ruled Springwood like a dowager duchess, tending gardens, greenhouses, the cow barn. But winter brought silence. She began taking breakfast in bed. Servants began to slip. A cook dismissed for being too cross, a caretaker called disgusting, a coachman, Sims, who had started drinking again. I tried to get Sims to sign the pledge, she wrote, but he refuses. By spring of 1902, she needed change. She rented a Boston apartment with her sister Dora, close enough to the university to be on hand, far enough not to interfere, she wrote. There, she hosted luncheons with old acquaintances from Hyde Park and Campobello. She made new friends too, Isabella Stewart Gardner and Julia Ward Howe, whom she described as a dear old thing, always dressed in soft white wool like a little nightgown. Weekends belonged to Franklin. She hosted teas for his Harvard friends and their sisters. She encouraged his passion for naval history, helping build what would become his vast collection, 7,000 books, 600 maritime prints. Boston gave Sarah what she craved more than quiet, purpose. For the first time since James's death, she was at the center of things again. But Franklin had learned to move through her world without fully belonging to it. He developed quiet strategies. He claimed late hours at the Crimson. Sometimes he simply didn't come home. His romantic life was hidden. His letters mentioned flirtations, never names. Sarah had tried to invite girls to Springwood. He called them pills, ice carts, elephantine. He knew even the suggestion of affection might be read as betrayal. He seems to have known, wrote Jeffrey C. Ward, that any sign of romantic interest would be seen by Sarah as betrayal of their exclusive devotion. In 1903, Franklin asked to travel to Europe with a classmate, his first trip abroad without her. It was only 4 weeks, but to Sarah, it was rebellion. She was stunned. "Of course, dearest Franklin," she replied. "I shall miss you, but I have no intention of tying you to my apron strings." She said the words, but she wept on the dock. "I meant to be very brave," she wrote. Back at Harvard, he began his final year. Sarah turned to his future. She imagined law, Columbia, not Harvard, New York, home. "I merely wish you would think seriously of it and realize how much it will be for you and for me to be near your own home, not too far out of reach." Then came a moment of fate. It was fall, 1902. Sarah sat in the parlor car of a northbound train, veiled in black lace. Franklin had gone to stretch his legs. Half an hour passed. When he returned, a young woman followed, tall, composed, with a steady smile, dark gloves, and an elegant coat. It was Eleanor Roosevelt, niece of the president. Franklin had spotted her in another carriage, reading quietly. They hadn't seen each other in years. Conversation came easily. Now, Eleanor greeted Cousin Sally with warmth and deference. Sarah nodded politely. She thought little of it. She didn't know what would follow. The weekends, the house parties, the quiet walks at Springwood. She didn't know that Franklin had begun filling Eleanor's dance card, or that Eleanor, twice a week, rode the rattling 2nd Avenue L down to the Lower East Side to teach immigrant girls how to dance. One afternoon, Franklin met her after class. A child had collapsed. Together, they carried her up 3 flights of tenement stairs, the stench and heat closing in around them. "I simply couldn't believe human beings lived that way," he kept saying. Sarah never heard the story, but Franklin had seen something rare in Eleanor: conviction. What Eleanor carried from Allenswood was not polish, it was purpose. "E is an angel," he wrote in his journal. When he invited Eleanor to Springwood, Sarah assumed it was courtesy, so when he announced their engagement that Thanksgiving, it struck like lightning. Sarah showed nothing publicly, but inwardly she reeled that her instinct had missed it, that her perfect, polished son had made a decision without her, that someone had taken her place. Sarah, precise, self-possessed, immaculately composed, would never fully understand her future daughter-in-law. She found her frail, unformed, a pupil, not a partner. Yes, she knew Eleanor's childhood had been difficult. But how, Sarah wondered, could a Roosevelt, the niece of a president, fail to overcome such things? In Sarah's world, legacy was armor, name was compass. What excuse remained for fragility? Eleanor's parents had once dazzled society. Anna Hall, a Hudson Valley beauty known for her languid grace, and Elliot Roosevelt, athletic, magnetic, and ruinously unreliable. When Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was born in 1884, her arrival was dutifully noted in the society columns. Her uncle Teddy stood as her godfather, but beneath the golden surface, the family was already unraveling. Elliot, a gifted playboy, spiraled into addiction. Anna, emotionally cool, failed to bond with her solemn, awkward child. On a visit to Hyde Park, when 2-year-old Eleanor hesitated in a doorway, Anna laughed. "Come in, Granny," she called. "She's such a funny child, so old-fashioned." Eleanor remembered the moment all her life. Her father, though adored, became a ghost in slow motion. He left for Europe, promising recovery. When he returned briefly, he took her for a walk, then vanished into the Knickerbocker Club, leaving her waiting alone for 6 hours. In 1892, Anna died of diphtheria. Soon after, Eleanor's little brother died. Then Elliot, drunk and despairing, drove a carriage into a lamppost. He was 34, Eleanor was 10. "From that time on," she wrote, "I lived with him more closely than when he was alive." She and her surviving brother, Hall, were sent to Oak Terrace, a crumbling mansion near Tivoli, to live with their grandmother, Mary Ludlow Hall, a woman who offered, in cousin Corinne Alsop's words, little more than leftover love. By adolescence, Eleanor was painfully shy and relentlessly self-critical. "I was always afraid," she recalled, "of the dark, of displeasing people, of failure." Her aunt Edith was blunt. She is very plain. Her teeth and mouth seem to have no future, but the ugly duckling may yet become a swan. The transformation began at 15. She was sent to Allenswood, a London school run by Marie Souvestre, an intellectual and moral force. Under Souvestre, Eleanor found something rare: belief. She returned to New York after 3 years, more composed, but summoned back to a house riddled with secrets. Her uncle fired pistols from his window. Her brother drank. The money was nearly gone. If you want a full story on the fascinating and tragic life of Eleanor Roosevelt, let me know in the comments. Sarah responded to the engagement in the only way she knew how: strategically. She reminded Franklin she held the purse strings and demanded a 1-year delay. She arranged a lunch with Eleanor in New York. "Franklin will spend time with me in Boston," she said. "Perhaps you'll join us, once or twice." The conversation was cordial, but the air between them was tight with unspoken truths. That night, Eleanor wrote Franklin, "Boy, darling, I have a hard letter to write. It's hard for her to realize anyone could want or need you more than she does. I mustn't complain, must I?" Franklin replied to Sarah, "I know my mind. Nothing can change what we are to each other, dear mummy. Now you have 2 children to love." Sarah had placed them both on the defensive, but she had also bought herself a year. Behind the smiles, she watched. Waited. She reached out to Joseph Choate, the U.S. ambassador to Britain, in search of a diplomatic post, any opportunity to delay the marriage. Choate replied, no positions were available, so she proposed a 6-week cruise for herself, Franklin, and his friend Lathrop Brown. It would mean missed classes, compromised grades, but she believed the voyage would restore their bond. Franklin agreed. The Prinzessin Victoria Louise carried them through the Danish West Indies, Puerto Rico, Barbados, Venezuela, Jamaica. Franklin played cards. Sarah basked in the attention of 2 young men. For a moment, it felt like before. He was her boy. She was the center of the orbit. Back in Washington, she arranged a meeting with Eleanor at Aunt Bamie's home. She even sat beside her at a White House dinner. The president was very delightful, she wrote. I wonder how small men can criticize and belittle him. In New York, she dined and shopped with Eleanor. The girl tried. I know 3 will never be the same as 2, Eleanor wrote, but someday I hope she will love me, or at least be reconciled. Sarah wasn't ready. She smiled, but behind the smile, she measured everything. Meanwhile, Franklin enrolled at Columbia Law School. President Roosevelt, his booming theatrical uncle, had gone there. Eager to please, Franklin mimicked his voice, his gestures, even adopted similar spectacles. Sarah approved. Columbia was close. She rented him a brownstone at 200 Madison Avenue, complete with servants, and a Lesbie brought down from Hyde Park. But once he settled in, the familiar ache returned. I am feeling pretty blue, she wrote. The journey is over. I feel as if the time may never come again when I shall take a trip with my dear boy. Still, she promised to accept Eleanor. I will love her and adopt her fully when the right time comes. I rejoice in your happiness and shall not put any stones or straws in the way. What she didn't say was that the right time would be hers to choose, not Franklin's. True to his word, Franklin kept the engagement secret for a year. During that time, Sarah moved with seamless purpose into the role of planner, guide, and mother-in-law to be. With Eleanor's mother long gone, Sarah stepped easily into the space. She chose fabrics, she handled lists, she summoned her own childhood of propriety and spectacle and spun it into quiet choreography. It gave her structure, it gave her purpose, and once again, it gave her control. In December 1904, the New York Times announced the engagement. Sarah stood poised as Eleanor crossed her threshold, welcomed in name but not in heart. She smiled for guests, nodded in approval, but behind the veil of civility, the balance had shifted. The engagement drew headlines, though attention leaned toward the president's niece. Well-wishers wrote from Groton, from Washington, from the White House. Teddy Roosevelt himself sent a glowing note. I am as fond of Eleanor as if she were my own daughter. Still, doubts lingered. Cousin Corinne Alsop would later reflect, she had lived through so much unhappiness, and then to marry a man with a mother like Cousin Sally, a more determined and possessive woman than I have ever known. In the short term, though, Eleanor was grateful. Sarah's world of rituals and structure offered something Eleanor had never known, a choreography she could follow, a shelter. On the eve of the wedding, March 16, 1905, Sarah wrote, This is Franklin's last night at home as a boy. Eleanor wore a stiff satin gown adorned with rose point Brussels lace, worn by her mother and grandmother. Sarah gifted her a pearl and diamond choker in the style of Queen Alexandra. 200 guests gathered, Roosevelts, Delanos, Halls, Vanderbilts. Sarah, in white silk and black lace, cut her usual striking figure. At 3:30 p.m., the president arrived to walk the bride down the aisle. Brass from the St. Patrick's Day parade thundered through the windows. Louder still was Teddy's parting line. Well, Franklin, there's nothing like keeping the name in the family. Moments later, guests flooded into the library to hear the president speak. He held court for over an hour. Alice Roosevelt later quipped, Father always wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Sarah was content. Everyone says it was the most perfect wedding, so simple, yet so elegant and refined, she wrote to Franklin. I was very proud of both my dear children. While the newlyweds spent a quiet week at Hyde Park, Sarah returned to Manhattan, preparing the next act like a stage set. At the Hotel Webster, she arranged flowers, oversaw the suite, and noted, went to my French lecture, came home to find my children, and brought them home to lunch with me. Later that spring, with law school behind them, Franklin and Eleanor sailed aboard the RMS Oceanic for a 3-month honeymoon. From Europe, Franklin's letters were breezy. We are having a scrumptious time. Eleanor's were more revealing. Dearest Mama, I look forward to our next long evening together, when I shall want to be kissed all the time. Ever and ever so much love, your devoted Eleanor. While they toured Europe, Sarah choreographed their return. She leased a house for them on East 36th Street, 3 blocks from her own. She hired a butler, housemaid, and cook. The house was furnished to her taste. The life they returned to had already been chosen. Eleanor, aware of her domestic inexperience, welcomed the help. You've done wonders for us, she wrote from Strasbourg. I'm afraid my unaided efforts would not be very successful. Sarah was pleased. She expected to remain ever present. As her biographer later wrote, it was part of her unconscious picture of the future, to share their responsibilities and decisions. In Manhattan, she dined with them often, then expected Franklin to escort her home. On weekends, she encouraged visits to Springwood. Franklin welcomed it. At Springwood, he was the favored son again, free to indulge in stamps, bird books, and long chats in the snuggery. Sarah presided at the table. Franklin sat to her right. Eleanor was often off to the side or on the floor. All her life an outsider in the homes of others, wrote Blanche Wiesen Cook. Eleanor was once again on the periphery, and for a time accepted it. I was beginning to be an entirely dependent person, Eleanor later wrote. At 21, Eleanor learned she was pregnant. Sarah had already noticed the lingering queasiness after Europe and summoned a doctor. Haunted by her own traumatic labor, Sarah was determined to be present. As the due date approached, she instructed her maid to lay out clothes nightly in case the call came. It came on the morning of May 3rd. At 1:15, a beautiful little girl was born. 10 pounds 1 ounce, Sarah wrote in her diary. A nurse, Blanche Spring, oversaw the birth. Sarah, meanwhile, tended to Franklin. Dear Eleanor and baby doing well. Franklin dines every evening with me, she wrote, without irony. Poor little Eleanor is upset, though brave, Sarah added. Eleanor later recalled, for the first year of my married life, I was completely taken care of. Sarah made the decisions, when to feed, which doctor to call, which nurse to hire. When Anna cried at night, the nurse, not the mother, was expected to respond. Parenting guides urged mothers to be present to establish boundaries. But Sarah's boundaries were internal and absolute. Eleanor occasionally objected. Franklin, ever conflict-averse, rarely intervened. And so, Sarah became the silent center of their household. She maintained her routines, charities, French lessons, concerts at the Waldorf. But Franklin, Eleanor, and baby Anna remained her quiet priority. 2 weekends a month, and every holiday, the young family returned to Springwood. Often, Anna stayed behind. I held baby from 6 to 7, Sarah noted. She was so lovely. She never openly criticized Eleanor's parenting. She didn't need to. Her diary recorded the interesting modern ideas of young mothers, like placing baby Anna in a chicken wire box outside a window for fresh air. The practice ended only when a neighbor, alarmed by the infant's cries, threatened to call the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Sarah's judgments were subtle, but never missed. She occasionally expressed irritation with Franklin, especially when he neglected Eleanor. At Christmas 1906, Eleanor was unwell. Sarah took her home early from a party. Franklin stayed and danced until dawn. The next morning, his cousin Corinne found him pale and sulking. Sarah had scolded him and insisted he come down for breakfast at 8 a.m. Eleanor, meanwhile, had breakfast in bed. That same year, Franklin began an unpaid clerkship at one of Wall Street's most prestigious firms. Sarah had arranged the position through her husband's old business partner. While the economy soared, factories booming, streets crowded with machines, Franklin walked to work through the roar of an industrializing nation. His firm often defended giants like Standard Oil and American Tobacco. A fellow clerk later recalled Franklin confiding his ambition. First, a seat in the state assembly, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and finally the governorship of New York. I want to be president, he said, and I think it's entirely reasonable. Sarah and Eleanor remained unaware. Neither woman would have encouraged him. Sarah disliked politics. Eleanor was immersed in motherhood. Over 10 years, she bore 6 children: Anna, James, Elliot, Franklin Jr., John, and a first Franklin Jr., who died in infancy. Sarah hovered. She dispensed advice, summoned doctors, organized christenings, and often took the children to Hyde Park or Campobello. Each baby wore Franklin's christening gown. Franklin, affectionate but distracted, roughhoused and handed out treats. But parenting fell to Eleanor, and increasingly to Sarah. She took many burdens off her daughter-in-law, wrote Rita Kleeman. But Eleanor was fading, moody, drained, distant. After her infant son's death in 1909, Eleanor collapsed inward. Sarah kept vigil beside the child's body for 24 hours. After the funeral, Franklin and Eleanor returned to Manhattan. The 2 older children remained at Springwood, as Eleanor sunk into a deep depression. Even before her first grandchild was born, Sarah had begun stitching herself more tightly into her son's life. Her 1905 Christmas gift was a drawing of a tall townhouse with smoke curling from its chimney. Construction began in spring. The home was not one, but two adjoining houses, one for Sarah, one for Franklin and Eleanor. Each side had 15 rooms and 4 bathrooms. Sarah selected the architect, paid for the build, and oversaw the furnishings. Eleanor, as was the case in the early years, left most decisions to Sarah and Franklin. "All the arrangements seem very good," she wrote. Sarah never knew that Eleanor found the house suffocating. Years later, Eleanor recalled a breakdown one evening when Franklin came home from work. "I said I did not like to live in a house that was not in any way mine, that I had done nothing about, that did not represent the way I wanted to live." Franklin, stunned, called her quite mad and walked out. Sarah ignored the signs, or chose to. She continued her lunches with Eleanor, her outings with the couple, and her familiar role as grandmother. She avoided emotional disorder. Feelings, emotions were not things to be discussed. She recalled her brothers and sisters who had died in childhood, how they were never spoken about. Grief was private. In 1910, everything changed. Franklin entered what Sarah still called the messy business of politics. Though he remained loyal to James's party, the Democrats, he accepted when local leaders asked him to run. His first move was to speak to Sarah. She was not pleased. She had imagined Franklin following James's genteel example, but she adjusted quickly. Many friends said it was a shame for so fine a young man to mix with dirty politicians, but I predicted the time would come when others from old families would enter politics. And there was a silver lining. "Franklin will be here now a great deal," she noted. The state capital was just 65 miles from Hyde Park. The odds were poor. His district hadn't elected a Democrat in 50 years. But the confident, well-connected candidate campaigned aggressively, traveling in a red roadster, out-organizing and outspending his opponent, backed by Sarah's money. Franklin won by 1,140 votes. Within days, Sarah was calling it Franklin's district. From then on, every campaign would begin, not with a rally, but on her porch. Franklin's victory reshaped more than his career. It altered the landscape of his marriage. He and Eleanor, without Sarah, went to Albany to find a home. Days later, Sarah arrived to inspect their choice, a large brownstone near the Capitol. "A fine house that could be made comfortable," she declared. It rented for $4,800, 3 times his Senate salary. Sarah paid it. She helped Eleanor settle in with their 3 small children, 2 maids, a wet nurse, and other staff. Sarah visited frequently, now driven in her new car, and sent produce and milk from Hyde Park. For the first time, Eleanor was no longer living beside her mother-in-law, and for the first time, she began to enjoy herself. She joined Franklin's political life more openly. Many colleagues found him arrogant. Francis Perkins, later Secretary of Labor, recalled him as aloof, not particularly charming, with an unfortunate habit of throwing his head back and looking down his nose at most people. But others were captivated. The New York Globe described him admiringly. Tall, physically fit to command, firm lips, white teeth, a Grecian nose, the glow of country health. Sarah, of course, beamed, telling anyone who would listen, "That's the Delano side." In the years that followed, Franklin aligned himself with progressive causes, policies to protect farmers, women, and children. Sarah approved and continued to preside at the Springwood table, even when the guests were unfamiliar, noisy, or unrefined. Only one issue caused friction: women's suffrage. Like Jenny Churchill, Sarah believed women wielded real power behind the scenes. She distrusted the banners and marches. The vote seemed unnecessary. Franklin disagreed. Despite resistance from rural constituents, his wife and his mother, he supported suffrage. Eleanor followed, reluctantly. "I took it for granted that men were superior creatures," she later wrote. "If my husband was a suffragist, I probably must be too. I was not a feminist in those early years." She didn't join the women's suffrage party. She complied, but didn't yet believe. Sarah, too, was unmoved by ideology. But once Franklin had made up his mind, she didn't object. She would have scoffed at the idea that men were naturally wiser, but saw no reason to quarrel with her son. Loyalty came first. When American women won the vote in 1920, 2 years after their British counterparts, Sarah embraced her new right. From then on, she cast every ballot for her son. not because she believed in the movement, but because she believed in him. In 1913, Franklin, now 31, left New York behind. After championing Woodrow Wilson's campaign, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. With Eleanor and their 3 children, he moved to Washington. Sarah's presence, once constant, now required trains, transfers, and time. She boarded the New York Central at Hyde Park, silver hair swept up, hat boxes in tow. Her maid traveled second class. In Manhattan, she paused at East 65th Street. Then, on to Washington. The capital was evolving. Cherry trees bloomed along the tidal basin. The cathedral crept skyward. Franklin arrived with pedigree and purpose. His Albany record offered substance. His lineage opened doors. Franklin, with typical flair, wrote, "Dearest Mama, baptized, confirmed, sworn in, vaccinated, and somewhere at sea." Sarah replied, lovingly but exacting, "You can't imagine the happiness you gave me. Try not to write your signature too small. So many public men have such awful signatures." Aunt Mamie Roosevelt offered them a townhouse on N Street, 4 stories, shaded by trees, just blocks from the Navy Department. It had no electricity, little room for a growing family, and belonged unmistakably to someone else. Once again, Eleanor stepped into another woman's house. Their income, about $20,000 a year, barely covered Franklin's indulgences, bespoke suits, club dues, endless books. Sarah sent checks for repairs, but refused an allowance. She soon arrived to help. "My mother-in-law, as usual, helped us to get settled," Eleanor later noted, dryly. Franklin thrived. Charming, confident, and increasingly versed in naval affairs, he pushed for a massive fleet expansion. Though Wilson promised neutrality, Franklin sensed war coming. Sarah followed his rise from Hyde Park, clipping articles into a scrapbook. He admired Churchill's boldness at the Admiralty. In 1915, Franklin tried to visit him, but Churchill, irked by American neutrality, declined. "No time," the ambassador said. Not the beginning either man would have predicted. Still, Sarah remained the family's fixed star. At Campobello, a pine-shaded path linked her cottage to Franklin's. That summer, Eleanor and the chicks, as Franklin called the children, escaped Washington's heat for sea air. Eleanor played the political wife. Naval tours, formal calls, state dinners. In a letter, she wrote, "F doesn't have time to breathe, but he seems to thrive on it." And when she was away, Sarah was there. "My mother-in-law always had an eye to the children, so there was no cause for anxiety," Eleanor later wrote. In August 1914, Sarah heard Franklin calling. Eleanor had gone into early labor. Robe flying, Sarah rushed across the lawn. Her 4th grandson, Franklin Jr., was born. As war broke out in Europe, Franklin was summoned back to Washington. He left quickly, knowing Sarah would take charge. Less than a month later, she helped Eleanor and the children move to Hyde Park. "All going well," she wrote to Franklin. "Baby is a little fussy, I think because Eleanor was up late. Eleanor is cheerful and will go to bed early tonight." The family stayed for a month until Eleanor was strong enough to return. When John was born 2 years later, Sarah arrived within hours. When whooping cough spread, she brought the older children north, read to them for hours, oversaw their schooling. The chicks spent weeks, even months with her, accompanied by nurses and governesses. "I was raised more by grandmother than by my parents," Anna later said. "She was the most solidly important adult in my childhood." Sarah enforced decorum with a gentle hand. She scolded lateness, corrected table manners, but showered warmth. James would later say the fastest way to get what your parents refused was to ask Granny. One spring, James asked for a garden. Sarah gave him land, seeds, and paid 50% over market for his vegetables. When Franklin objected, Sarah was baffled. Surely, dear James should be rewarded for initiative. In 1917, as America entered the war, Eleanor joined the Red Cross canteen, serving sandwiches at Union Station, volunteering with shell-shocked veterans at St. Elizabeth's. With the children at Springwood, she wrote to Sarah, "How lucky we are to have you. Very few mothers mean as much to their daughters as you do to me." Springwood grew with the family. Sarah added new wings, a 3rd floor, and 7 bathrooms. She oversaw the building of a grand library with twin marble fireplaces and Roosevelt coats of arms. There, Franklin worked on his stamp collection, studied naval maps, met guests. In the front hall, his childhood bird specimens were displayed behind glass, a boyhood curated by Sarah. Photos soon showed Franklin on the portico, flanked by his mother and wife, projecting command, charm, continuity. But beneath the public image, one truth remained. The house he stood in was hers. She had laid every stone. But the true test came in 1918. Franklin, then in Washington, had begun an affair. The woman was Lucy Mercer, 23, beautiful, poised, Eleanor's part-time secretary. Gentle where mother had a schoolmarm's air, Elliot Roosevelt said, outgoing where mother was introverted. Sarah approved of her. So sweet and attractive, she had written from Washington. She adores you, Eleanor. No one knew the truth. While Eleanor summered at Campobello, Franklin took Lucy on drives in his Stutz or aboard the Navy's yacht, Sylph. The affair had likely begun in 1916. Eleanor, perhaps sensing something, wrote to Sarah on her wedding anniversary, "You'll never know how grateful I am for what Franklin has given me and what you have done to make it so." Then Franklin left for Europe. He toured battlefields, met kings and ministers, was snubbed by Churchill, a stinker, he would later say. On the return voyage aboard the Leviathan, he collapsed. Spanish flu, then double pneumonia. He lay near death as the ship creaked through the waves and the dead were buried at sea. Sarah and Eleanor met the ship in New York. Franklin was carried into Sarah's house on East 65th Street. Sarah oversaw the orderlies. Eleanor unpacked his cases and found the letters. Lucy's letters. "The bottom dropped out of my world," Eleanor later told her daughter Anna. Her father's betrayal had returned in Franklin's hands. What followed was never recorded in Sarah's diary. Those pages are missing. The affair went unmentioned until long after they were gone. Eleanor never addressed it in her memoirs. Washington knew, but said nothing. Still, the emotional choreography is clear. Eleanor, shattered, offered Franklin the chance to leave. Sarah, calm, unsparing, did not. Her voice, low but unyielding, told her son, "If you leave Eleanor, you will not receive another dollar." Franklin might have left Eleanor, but he knew he could never leave Sarah. Franklin stayed. The affair ended. The marriage endured, but changed. Eleanor withdrew. As she told Anna years later, "That's when I moved out of our room." After the crisis, Sarah returned to control. She arranged for Franklin to oversee demobilization in Europe. When Secretary Daniels hesitated, she paid him a visit. On January 1st, 1919, Franklin and Eleanor sailed to Paris. Sarah resumed command, organizing the household, keeping the youngest children in Manhattan, installing Hyde Park's first electric washing machine, and each night, singing hymns with the boys before bed. Eleanor wrote warm letters from the peace conference. "I hope we never have to separate again. I think I'm becoming a clinging vine." But something had shifted. Her letters grew careful. Her emotional dependence unraveled. "I'm so sorry I hurt you, Mummy dear," she wrote. "Of course, you know I love Franklin and the children dearly and am deeply devoted to you." In a quieter note to Franklin, Eleanor said that Sarah and her sisters, with their serene assurance and absolute judgments, made her want to squirm and turn Bolshevik. That spring, Eleanor returned to Campobello. Franklin went to San Francisco for the Democratic National Convention. Sarah welcomed the children to Hyde Park and wrote often, running barefoot, swimming, all rosy and well. On June 25th, she added, "I'm sure San Francisco will be most interesting, and I hope elevating, as the old letters used to say. But I fancy that's not very likely in a crowd of every sort of politician." She never loved politics. But when the telegram arrived, Franklin had been nominated as James Cox's running mate. She was thrilled. Sarah replied at once, "You must stop the train at Hyde Park. Your friends want to welcome you home. If and when you are elected, you will belong to the nation. But for now, you are our boy of Hyde Park." Eleanor, now at Campobello, learned of the nomination through Sarah. Her reply was telling, "Whatever Franklin achieves must be largely due to you." Sarah cherished it and copied it into her diary. 2 months after the 1920 election, during his official nomination for vice president, 5,000 guests packed Springwood. Sarah stood proudly among them as Franklin, from the portico, declared, "We oppose money in politics, the private control of national finances, and the treatment of human beings as commodities." The Cox-Roosevelt ticket lost badly, but Franklin returned to New York energized, already thinking of the next campaign. In 1921, Sarah resumed her tradition of European travel. From London, she sent Franklin a jaunty note about her boldest move yet, a twin-engine flight to Paris. He was horrified. "Don't do it again," he cabled. She returned to New York in late August aboard a luxury liner. But it wasn't Franklin who met her. It was her brother and stepson. Her brother delivered the news. Franklin had polio. Sarah hid her shock. "Well, son," she told him on arrival, "this strikes me as a queer party to give me on my return." Her vibrant son now lay in bed, unable to lift his arm above his shoulders. Eleanor and Lewis Howe were bathing, feeding, and comforting him. She wrote a friend, "Below his waist he cannot move at all. His legs, that I have always been proud of, must be shifted often, or they ache." She believed only one path remained. Franklin must abandon politics, return to Springwood, live as his father had. The future she had imagined for him was collapsing, but Franklin refused. Much like Sarah, he would not quit. For 7 years, he searched for recovery in warm southern waters, first on a Florida houseboat, then in the mineral springs of Georgia. He was often accompanied not by family, but by his secretary, Missy LeHand. Sarah disliked how Missy guarded Franklin's time. Rumors of an affair swirled. Eleanor ignored them. She was now finding her own voice, and Lewis Howe drew her into politics. He saw the mind that had slept since Allenswood and challenged her to use it. Even after polio, Howe refused to let Franklin fade. He pushed Eleanor into the spotlight to keep his name alive. She rose to the challenge, joining the New York State Democratic Party's women's division and forging ties with unions and reformers. It helped that she had space, away from Springwood and from Sarah. Sarah still believed by encouraging Franklin to give up politics, she was protecting him. Her grandson James recalled, "She was bitterly opposed to father's return to public life after he was paralyzed. She fought Howe and Mother on this." Sarah could not fathom the struggle in his third-floor bedroom. Franklin hoisting his legs with a towel, willing dead limbs to obey. Nor could she understand why Eleanor and Howe insisted on filling the house with political visitors. Sarah appeared, uninvited, through the connecting door between their Manhattan homes, trying to control the situation as she always had. Eleanor blocked the door between their homes. Mother fluttered with rage. Granny stood rigid, jaw outthrust in indignation. Anna said. Sarah saw her son and Eleanor as selfish, caring more for ambition than their children. She encouraged Anna's resentment toward her parents. The children, then aged 5 to 15, were now looked after mostly by Sarah. When measles and mumps spread, she hired a nurse. She brought the children to Springwood for the summer, arranged governesses, and smoothed tensions Eleanor no longer had time to address. That spring, she swept James and Anna off to Europe. But in Versailles, Sarah herself fell, tripping on a stone step and spending days in bed while the children explored the city alone. More and more, it was Sarah, not Eleanor, whom the children turned to in crisis. James recalled how when he fell ill at school, it was Sarah, not his parents, who came to bring him home. Still, she remained involved with Eleanor and Franklin. When Eleanor began hosting political gatherings, Sarah arranged the luncheons. She presided, but gave Eleanor the floor. Whether it was affection, strategy, or evolution, she had become more open-minded than before. Then came Madison Square Garden, June 1924. After 3 years out of public life, Franklin stepped forward to nominate Al Smith for president. He still couldn't walk unaided, refused a wheelchair, and rehearsed for weeks with 16-year-old James in their home library. "He leaned on me so hard it hurt," James said. His breathing was labored. His hands were wet with sweat. At the podium, James handed him the second crutch. Franklin, with fierce resolve, walked 15 feet alone. The crowd of 12,000 delegates watched in silence, then erupted. A 3-minute ovation shook the arena. Later, Sarah told her biographer that a shaft of light fell through a crack in the roof and touched her son's head like a halo. At home, she clipped the story. Win or lose, Roosevelt stands out as real hero of convention. Did she believe the halo? Or the headline? For once, it didn't matter. The path was re-emerging, and this time, Sarah let him walk it. By 1925, Franklin had begun treatment with Dr. William McDonald, a Massachusetts physician. Sarah was hopeful. "Once he can walk with crutches and without braces, strength will follow," she wrote. "For the first time in over a year, I feel work is being done for you, my dearest." But the emotional strain within the family deepened. Eleanor's dependence gave way to quiet resentment. Sarah, fiercely attached to the children, once told them, "I am more your mother than she is." Eleanor was livid. A guest overheard Sarah scolding her for arriving at dinner without brushing her hair. Franklin, ever conflict avoidant, arranged a quiet solution. In 1926, Eleanor moved into a modest stone cottage called Valkill, a mile from Springwood. There she found freedom and friendship with Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman. Valkill became her refuge, from Springwood, from marriage, from the mother-in-law who still believed she belonged elsewhere. Sarah was baffled. "She belongs here," she told friends. "I don't know why she goes over there every night. If she wants to swim, she can do that during the day." The children sensed the growing divide. "Granny moved with unflagging firmness to fill the gap," Eliot wrote. "Father was too sick to be fully present. Mother was bent on building a life of her own." Sarah signed the checks and made the rules. When Franklin Jr. and John lost their pony as punishment, she bought them horses. When Anna married a stockbroker without telling her parents, Sarah gave them an apartment. Eleanor wrote to Franklin, "It's all I can do to be decent." Yet the children adored her. James said, "We were lucky to have a grandmother who would do for us when we had a mother who would not, and a father who could not." Sarah's role began to shift. Eleanor had her own voice now. What Sarah thought became less and less important, James wrote. In 1926, she quietly funded a library in Hyde Park in her husband's memory, paying for it herself despite Franklin's concerns. Her siblings were dying off. Only Fred, Dora, and Cassie remained. Dora, now in Paris, became her confidant. Age crept in. Sarah still dressed elegantly but used a motorized tricycle in private. She walked unaided in public, but pain had settled in her eyes. In 1928, she was at Warm Springs when Franklin was asked to run for governor. His doctor advised against it. So did Sarah. When he agreed, he told the delegation, "Don't let my mother know." But Sarah found out. "If this costs me my son," she snapped, "I shall never forgive you." Yet she rallied. "If he does run," she told friends, "I hope he wins." She contributed to his campaign and wrote, "If you're elected and the salary is less, I will make up the difference." On election night, early headlines declared defeat. But Sarah stayed up, seated by the tally desk. At 4 a.m., the tide turned, and Franklin won. Sarah nearly ran up the steps at Springwood, and she were once again part of her son's future. While Eleanor taught in Manhattan, Sarah acted as First Lady of New York. Missy LeHand managed the household. Frances Perkins recalled seeing Sarah on the lawn, reading in a wicker chair, hair curled, Franklin and Eleanor nearby. Her devotion to her son's incomprehensible taste for politics took her over the hurdles, Perkins said. She became friends with people she'd never have met otherwise. Still, Eleanor resented Sarah's lavish gifts, cars for the boys, cash to Anna and James. Franklin refused to intervene. Sarah had funded his career. His assent returned her to her favorite role, the mother behind the man. She beamed when he won re-election in 1930, as whispers of a presidential run began. In 1931, a telegram arrived. Sarah had pneumonia in Paris. Gravely ill, she was in the American hospital. Franklin canceled everything and boarded the Aquitania. Sarah insisted on sitting up when he arrived. Her bed had been moved to face the garden, but that day she watched the door. When it opened, she recalled, and that handsome son of mine stood there with his arm around his own tall son, I was very emotional. I was still very weak. Eliot credited her recovery to Granny's iron will. Back home, Lewis Howe persuaded her to give an interview for Good Housekeeping. She complied, reluctantly. The articles became the book My Boy Franklin. She hated the publicity. When she saw ads on Hearst trucks, she was appalled. My name is going all over town on trucks. She especially hated the mention of too much chloroform during childbirth. When the authors returned, she waved them off. I can't remember anything else. Mama is like that, Franklin said, then picked up the pen and finished the story she had carried for so long but could no longer bear to tell. She had shaped his world in silence and steel. Now, at last, she laid it down. In the early hours of July 1st, 1932, Sarah sat with Franklin and Eleanor at the Albany governor's mansion, listening to radio updates from the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Franklin smoked. Eleanor knitted. By the fourth ballot, he secured the Democratic nomination for president. At 10:32 p.m., the organ struck up Happy Days Are Here Again. Sarah beamed. Franklin flew to Chicago. As the plane took off, he dictated, All well, much love, FDR. After landing, he phoned his mother, then entered the stadium to thunderous applause. When reporters asked for comment, Sarah replied, "Of course I'm glad, but I wasn't very much surprised." On the radio, she heard Franklin proclaim, "I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people." The words would have scandalized her father, who had once said, "Not all Democrats are horse thieves, but all horse thieves are Democrats." But Sarah had changed. Born before the Civil War, raised to revere order and bloodline, she had embraced something far more radical, a son who defied the world she came from, and a love that made her let him. The Republicans were crushed. When Franklin returned to East 65th Street, Sarah was waiting, weeping with pride. "This is the greatest night of my life," he told her. He would be president for the rest of her life, and his. Sarah embraced public life. Once reluctant, she now took pleasure in ceremony. She rode the inaugural train, and at dinners and balls, she glowed. A week before the inauguration, My Boy Franklin was published. Time placed her, not Franklin, on the cover. Few mothers, it wrote, have known the exaltation that Sara Delano Roosevelt will feel. On Inauguration Day, she rose early. In her long coat and fox fur, she sat near the podium. That night, 72 Roosevelts and Delanos gathered for the inaugural dinner. Her spine was straight, her eyes commanding, her pearls gleaming, recalled Eliot. She was majestic. The White House soon became a small, intimate hotel. Guests came and went. Expenses ballooned. Sarah subsidized the presidency with $100,000 a year. She met Franklin's guests, scheduled his visitors, and made sure her banker friends were seen. Staff called her the Duchess. In May 1933, she was named Mother of the Year. Her Mother's Day broadcast echoed her son's fireside tone. "My son, the president, has lifted this day above sentiment. Millions of mothers pray not for candy, but for bread." Sarah became a symbolic presence, admired, dignified, untouchable. Literary Digest compared her to a queen mother. In England, she dined with Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald and took tea with King George. Newsweek placed her on the cover. But she came to the White House less. She preferred Hyde Park. Franklin, amid global crisis, visited often, every few weeks. The estate became the summer White House. Sentry boxes appeared. New phone lines were strung. Sarah always greeted him on the portico. She still fussed. He still smiled. And he always left feeling restored. She hosted guests with elegance. Bishops, labor leaders, socialites. Only Huey Long drew her disdain. "Who is that horrible man?" she asked Eleanor. "I feel sorry for Franklin," Long later muttered. "He's got more SOBs in his family than I got in mine." On her 80th birthday, Eleanor hosted a party at Springwood, and Franklin toasted, "To the best mother in the land." Her grandchildren presented a scroll, "Hyde Park means you, and all the fun you gave us there." But as Franklin's duties grew, Sarah saw him less. Then came 1939. That June, royalty came to Hyde Park. Franklin had invited King George VI and Queen Elizabeth to solidify ties as Europe edged toward war. In Washington, a record crowd cheered their parade. But at Springwood, history turned personal. Sarah, regal in pearls and silk, welcomed them at the door. On her piano sat autographed portraits of royalty. To her, Eliot wrote, reigning monarchs were among the few who matched her dignity. She became the first American woman to entertain a British monarch in her home, but she disliked the picnic menu, hot dogs and strawberry shortcake. "My mother thinks you should have tea," Franklin quipped. "My mother would have said the same," the king replied. At the formal dinner, Sarah's butler was offended by White House staff. A folding table collapsed, shattering china. Still, the evening triumphed. That night, the king told his prime minister, "Why don't my ministers talk to me like the president? I felt like a son being advised by a wise father." The china was broken, but the illusion held. Sarah's final state occasion was her finest. She was 85. Her joints ached, but her purpose endured. "Perhaps I've lived too long," she told Franklin, "but when I hear your voice, I never want to leave you." That summer, when Germany and the Soviets signed a pact, she rushed home from Europe. "I want to relieve my son of any anxiety in this crisis," she said as she boarded the ship. Back at Hyde Park, she was often alone. Franklin had war to prepare. Eleanor had speeches, travels, her My Day column. Still, she made time for Sarah. Visits, family updates, walks in New York. Franklin visited more than ever. 56 days during the 1940 campaign. He asked her to consider a companion. She refused. That fall, he won a third term. Sarah stood beside him on the portico as torchbearers paraded past. "I am now a mother of history," she said. "When you read history, it seems most presidents didn't have mothers, the way they fail to appear." Sarah's body was aging, but her presence was indelible. She had built the world he walked through, and watched him remake the world in return. In January 1941, reporters watched as Sarah walked slowly onto the inaugural platform, leaning on a polished cane. "She moved more slowly than in 33, wrote the Washington Star. That summer, she made one final journey to Campobello, still requiring ferries, trains, and ladder climbs. Eleanor came with her and saw how much she struggled. Sarah now accepted help. A nurse from Boston arrived. Kathleen Crawford, a quiet companion, read to her and helped her dress. Franklin sent a note. "Dearest Mama, I'm so glad you're feeling better and that you do what the nurse says." Sarah dictated her reply. "We have a lovely day and I'm sitting in a sunny window. I think laziness is my chief trouble. I think of you night and day." But she rarely left her room. Her heart was failing. Her memory, too. She left Campobello in August, stopping in Manhattan, then returning home to Springwood. Eleanor met her there. The next morning at breakfast, she noticed Sarah's pallor, her breath catching. She called Franklin. He wired back, "Catching the overnight train." Sarah brightened. "I'll greet him on the portico," she promised. But the next morning, she couldn't stand. Instead, she was propped on the chaise at the foot of the bed, where 59 years earlier, she had given birth to the man who would help give America strength during one of its darkest nights. Her white hair was braided and tied with a blue ribbon. She waited. Tires crunched in the drive. The elevator whined. Franklin wheeled into the room, beaming. He stayed all day, talking softly, remembering the past, pausing only for urgent telegrams. He shared one special confidence. The secret summit in Argentia. The man who once dismissed him, Winston Churchill, had pressed him to act. He puffed cigars, invoked destiny, charmed like his mother before him. Franklin listened, smiled, sidestepped. He had long practiced the art of saying no gently, first with Sarah. Still, he saw something rare in Churchill: resolve, vision, kinship. A bond had formed. The world was turning. And the woman who shaped his steadiness, his self-belief, was fading beside him. As the sun dropped behind the Hudson, Sarah dozed. Franklin kissed her cheek and rolled downstairs for dinner. The family agreed. She just needed rest. But by 9:30 p.m., her nurse realized Sarah had slipped into a coma. Franklin returned to her room and sat silent beside the woman who taught him resilience, pride, and poise, and watched her slip away. He stayed the night beside her. At noon the next day, Sunday, September 7, 1941, Sara Delano Roosevelt died. Her passing was as she had lived, composed, dignified, serene. Franklin canceled his schedule. Eleanor arranged the funeral at St. James Church. At the burial, Franklin stood dry-eyed as her coffin was lowered beside James's. Days later, in his new presidential archive, an aide handed him a box, wrapped in tissue, each item labeled in Sarah's unmistakable hand. Her wedding gloves, his baby shoes, a lock of his hair, school letters tied with ribbon. He wept. It was the first time any staffer had seen the president cry. Eleanor offered a tribute in my day. A very vital person whose strongest trait was loyalty to her family. There was a streak of jealousy and possessiveness. But privately, she said more. I looked at her face after she died and understood so many things. It is dreadful to live so close to someone for 36 years and feel no deep affection or sense of loss. Even decades later, Eleanor struggled with her emotions. Sarah had rescued her marriage, had given her financial security, had in silence freed her from the duties of motherhood so she could become the Eleanor Roosevelt remembered today. But neither woman ever said the words that might have healed them. Sarah was born before electricity, before the telephone, before the Civil War. In a house of order and refinement, where the bell rang for breakfast and governesses taught Latin beneath the beech trees of Algonac. Her father stitched her scalp without flinching. Her mother played nocturnes on the piano with hands that never trembled. She was raised to be composed, exacting, and silent in her sorrows, burying sisters and brothers and grief. But behind that composure was a force of nature. Sarah crossed the oceans of the 19th century, the South China Sea, the storm-swept Atlantic, the drawing rooms of Paris, and returned with a spine of steel and a mind trained to command. She did not hunger for attention, but she refused to be ignored. She married late, chose carefully, and when her son was born, she did not simply love him, she shaped him. She nursed him, schooled him, shadowed him, protected him. When others gave their children to nannies, Sarah kept hers. When Eleanor struggled with infants, Sarah stepped in. When Franklin stumbled, she steadied. She kept his baby shoes, his letters, his future. She paid his tuition, his campaign bills, his rent. She built his house, 2 of them actually, and left doors connecting them to hers. When he fell ill with polio, it was Sarah who paid for the train, arranged the hospital, and sat quietly in the hallway as Eleanor took over. She tried to convince him to retire. He refused. And though it broke every instinct in her body, she let him go. And when, years later, he crossed the stage at Madison Square Garden on 2 crutches to nominate Al Smith, she said she saw a shaft of light fall through the roof and touch his head like a halo. Did she believe in halos? Maybe not. But she believed in Franklin. And when he became president, it was Sarah who laid out her pearls. Sarah who boarded the inaugural train. Sarah who stood in the snow as her boy took the oath. She stood by him at Hyde Park, sent eggs, paid bills, managed staff, greeted monarchs. She took tea with kings. She told off Huey Long. She gave her son to a nation, but she never gave him up. When the world grew louder, she grew quieter. When Eleanor found her voice, Sarah let her speak. When the grandchildren floundered, she was their anchor. And when Franklin stood at the center of history, she stood just behind him. Composed, braided, steady. And in the end, it was Sarah, not society, not scandal, not even war, who gave the world Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Not by ambition, but by belief. She paid for every stone. She laid the path, and she stayed just long enough to watch him walk it. A woman forged in silence, who gave her strength, not her name. Who built a president and vanished into the shadow of his greatness. Not forgotten, just folded into the story he became. Still there, still standing, even when the world no longer looked back. Thank you for watching this video on Sara Delano Roosevelt. This story is dedicated to my own mother, and to all mothers. The forgotten names, the quiet strengths, the ones who helped us walk, picked us up when we fell, and stood in the background so we could step into the light. And thank you, truly, for watching. For every like, every comment, every share. In a world that favors fast clips and fleeting trends, you chose something slower, deeper, more human. This channel was never meant to chase headlines. It was born from a different kind of dream, to tell the real stories. Not the polished myths, not the easy edits, but the complicated, glorious, unfinished truth. So many women have been forgotten. Others reduced to caricatures, saints, sinners, scandals. But here, because of you, we tell their stories in full. Their brilliance and their brokenness, their triumphs, their contradictions, history as it was lived, not as it was trimmed. This is a small channel. No studio, no sponsors, just a mission and the mythic men and women who believe in it. To our subscribers, our patrons, our channel members, you are not just viewers, you are stewards of memory, guardians of the voices that history left behind. And one day, when this project becomes something greater, when these stories reach those who need them most, let it be known, you helped build that, quietly, faithfully, together. To our wonderful patrons and channel subscribers, the mythic men and women who fund these stories believing in the way history should be told, you are the true heroes. Thank you for making these videos possible. Velocity Girl Zen Life 68, Jillian Barker, Kimberly Ray, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafum Chung, Harry Thurston, Anna Livy, Michelle Lynn Neal, Karen Craig, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh, Joy McGuire, Elizabeth, CTS Bathory, America Marie, Amanda Lynn, Snowball, The Inappropriate Heifer, Kendra McNally, Marianne Nelson, Deborah Shepard, Ida Kloster Jensen, Kay Philomeny, Jules Mack, Real Steel Magnolia, Maureen Tommen, Black Knight 5897, Sammy Lott, Karen Possible, Joanne Thomas Yaketo, Deborah Chmielewski, Steve Weinstein, Joya Supreme, Laura Lamond, Beverly Cox Thompson, DDH, Beth Dawson, Stephanie Warren Smith, Sue Whitaker, PB, Monica Krista Schaefer Hazlett, Marcy Joe, Wendy Fairfull, Trudy DeSwart, T. Monroe, Catherine Wolfe, Janet Phelps, Roxanne Schuster, Kathleen Martin, Marina Barron, Melissa Pouliot, Kelly Brown, Gwen, Melissa Gilmore, Kelly Patwell, Marsha Corbin, Lisa Karen, Catherine Ratensky Harrison, Michael Nelson Black Cat Tarot, Chrissy Bethune, and Hesta Kirsten, Karen Craig, Michael Dean Augustin, Chris Miller, Catherine Davison, Catherine Wolfe, Randy Fox, Lucy Gonzalez, Curious Traveler, Deb Fisher, Indira Betcha, Dreaming of the Kingdom, Murphy's Bed, Michelle Griffin McGregor, M. King, Cliffa Height, and Sumari Henderson. Thank you, and a special shout out to this week's trivia winners. Lisa Craig, 4585, and JML 238. Well done. And finally, to all the silent men and women out there watching the video till the last note plays. Thank you. Until next time, stay curious, stay strong, keep exploring history, and as always, thanks for watching Mythic Women.